Chapter 16.
My God, it feels good.
Page 457 and 8.
Very
Sweet
nice.
baby Jesus times 10.
Someone's been reading it.
457 guesses.
Now
You're
hold
right.
me for the day.
Way to go.
Hopefully you know all those volumes inside. If you don't know those yet, you'll need to. They're on your test. All these. This is great multiple choice question stuff. Look at all the
This is
different
great.
choices.
This is just great.
The amount of air
God.
left in your lungs after you breathe out an entire exhalation as hard as you can is called the residual volume. Good job, Michael.
Every day.
All right. Today, the reading tonight the reading talks about one of the things is about control of your breathing, and this diagram shows it very well. There are two areas of your brain stem that control breathing. This little area right here, and in the pons, says it's called the pontine respiratory group. I guess that refers to the pons. That might be pontine, I'm not sure. Anyway, that little bit of the pons, and these two parts of the medulla oblongata all control respiration and breathing. And so, the majority of the breathing control is the pons here, and what we call the dorsal respiratory group. Dorsal in that it lies toward the back of the brain versus toward the front. So there's the dorsal respiratory group. It sends a signal out. It has a little synapse there in the spinal cord and goes out to the diaphragm. Are you all following here? And the diaphragm does most of the breathing for you. If you ever have brain damage and that area stops working, you'll stop breathing. And a lot of people have to be on a ventilator or something if they've had brain damage. The ventilator helps send the signals to the diaphragm to breathe for you. Now, the other respiratory group, which is right here, the ventral respiratory group, that sends signals. If you follow the gold line here, Lee, you with me here?
Yeah.
Follow these signals down, and then they go down to these muscles, the internal intercostals, and the external intercostals. Those help out with breathing, and so that's what these signals come for. That's for taking extra deep breaths. Remember when I said if you want to take an extra deep breath, your chest goes way out and it's pulled by those muscles? So, those two sets of muscles are controlled by the ventral respiratory group. The ventral respiratory group controls strong, forceful breathing. Dorsal respiratory group controls normal breathing that the diaphragm does. I always remember dorsal, diaphragm. They both start with D. And the diaphragm is your normal breathing muscle. And then also the pons helps out with that dorsal respiratory group as well. Exciting, isn't it? So there we go. Ventral respiratory group sends nerve impulses for forceful breathing. Dorsal respiratory group sends nerve impulses for basic breathing. And the pontine respiratory group is helping out some. I've never heard that, by the way, until this edition of this book, that word. That might be a new word. I just heard it was the pons that helped. That's what it's now called, the pontine respiratory group. What do you know? Now, there are special nerves that send messages to the brain, and that's these right here going up to the brain, that can tell you if there's enough oxygen and such in the blood. And It's part of the carotid artery group, and in the aorta, there are receptors that can sense how, if you need more oxygen, if the heart needs to beat faster, and if breathing needs to be stimulated. So those are the two. The aorta and the carotid arteries are where the sensors are to see if you have enough oxygen. I think we talked about that before in the chapter on circulatory system. Now this shows the alveoli is the big bubble right here. And this thin membrane right here, there's cells surrounding the alveoli. These flat cells that it's showing here. This diagram is kind of 3D. It's got the cells on top. But the edge of these cells, do y'all remember what type of cells these are that make up the alveolus that surround it? They have a certain name. It's a simple, flat,
stratified column.
not stratified,
Pseudocommon.
not pseudo,
I don't know what it means.
that make up the walls of the alveolus. Simple.
Squamous.
Squamous. Very good. Simple squamous epithelium.
Okay, doctor.
That's right. It makes, Dow's not here, I'll pitch in. So simple squamous epithelium makes up, you can see there's the nucleus of one of the cells, makes up these flat cells that surround the alveolus. Now this is empty space in the middle. And so the air comes in, and when you breathe, it gets into these alveoli. And then this is a capillary. These cells here make up the walls of the capillary. And so that's where the blood goes through, and that's where the air is. And so this thin layer of membrane is actually two cell membranes. The simple squamous cell membrane that surrounds the alveolus, and the simple squamous cell membrane that surrounds the capillary. Two of those, the oxygen just goes right through, can diffuse right through, and get into the blood. Is it off?
No,
It's off?
it's on.
It is.
It's
Blinking. Why is it blinking? Okay.
you have a hand on your back.
One of the things that you need to know, well, first of all, there's macrophages. What's a macrophage? You know what that is?
It kills all of the
Yeah, it's a white blood cell. And it crawls around inside your alveoli trying to kill foreign invaders, anything bad that makes it down there. And another thing, see that word fluid with surfactant. There's a thin layer of fluid that surrounds the entire alveolus. And it's called surfactant. And it's kind of a soapy material. And what it does, the alveolus is like a balloon. When you breathe in, the alveolus swells up like a balloon swells up. And when you breathe out, the alveolus goes back down and becomes flat. And the thing is, the walls of that alveolus, if there's not surfactant, they'll stick together. And you won't be able to reinflate the lungs with the next breath. You have to have this chemical, it's called surfactant, that lines the inside of the alveolus. Only then can the alveoli open up. Otherwise, the water acts as kind of like a glue that holds the thing shut, holds the alveolus shut. This is why you can't have a baby born prematurely. If a baby is born before about 7 months pregnant, maybe around 6 months pregnant, their lungs aren't making surfactant yet. And they can't pull in air to open up those lungs, open up the alveoli. That surfactant is produced by these cells. They produce a little surfactant, squirt it out, and it lines the whole alveolus. There's a little video here about that. I want you to see it. Pretty cool. Pretty inspiring. Pretty exciting.
Premature births present doctors with a series of unique and difficult challenges.
When Adriana Mancini was born 3 months prematurely, her chances of survival were extremely poor. She weighed only 1 pound, 10 ounces, and her lungs were so underdeveloped she couldn't breathe on her own.
Doctors battled to keep her alive, but all of their attempts to keep her lungs working failed.
Having exhausted all treatments, doctors took desperate measures. Using an experimental technique, they saved her life by drowning her lungs in liquid. Here's the story of how they did it. Say hello to Adriana Mancini, one of the first pioneers in liquid breathing. Today she is nearly 3 years old, healthy and full of life. But at birth she was delivered 3 months premature and weighed less than 2 pounds. She was born fighting for her life. Wrapped in a plastic blanket for warmth, her eyes heavily bandaged to protect them from light, Adriana was struggling to survive in an environment she was not yet physically equipped for. Her most life-threatening complication was that her lungs would not stay open, even on a ventilator, because she was not yet producing a coating in her lungs called surfactant.
Surfactant is a substance made by the lung that coats all of our lungs and allows them to stay open. Without surfactant, our lungs will collapse.
It was as if you were blowing up a balloon for the first time. Every breath was like that for her. Her lungs just would not stay open.
Surfactant treatments were given to Adriana the first night of her life to keep her lungs open. But the tiny baby was getting sicker and sicker.
I just said more prayers than I ever probably have said in my life. I just knew that we were praying for a miracle.
That miracle turned out to be an amazing fluid called Liquivent or perflubron. It was Adriana's only hope for survival. A substance that looks like water, perflubron, would fill her lungs and keep them from collapsing. It would also transfer oxygen directly into her bloodstream. How does it do that?
Here's a little beaker with perflubron in it, or Liquivent as the case may be. It's a clear, colorless liquid. Looks just like water. It has no odor. You pour it on yourself. The only function that it has in the body is to transport oxygen. But it is absorbing oxygen from the air, transferring it into my skin. And it would similarly absorb CO2, carbon dioxide from my blood and transfer it out.
How well does it transfer oxygen? Well enough to allow this mouse to actually breathe while submerged for several minutes with no harmful effects. After 5 minutes as a liquid breather, the test subject is toweled off, none the worse for wear. Now, a mouse is hardy enough to sit completely submerged in Liquivent. A fragile newborn is not. A new system would have to be developed to deliver the chemical to the premature lungs. How'd they do that? Adriana's lungs were filled with Liquivent by introducing it directly through her inhalation tube.
We need to change the tube. That means we take the old breathing tube out, which goes from the mouth into the lungs, and put another plastic tube in. And after we changed the tube, we filled Adriana's lungs with Liquivent. We knew that because when we stopped filling it, the liquid actually came out the tube. So we knew that she was totally filled to the top, much like you would top off a tank of gas.
As the tiny baby began to breathe through the liquid, constant attention was given to keep the levels in her lungs topped off. The chemical evaporates more quickly than water, so teaspoon-sized boosters of Liquivent were added every other hour. Miraculously, the liquid-filled lungs were staying open, and monitors revealed oxygen levels in Adriana's blood were rising dramatically.
I'll never forget the feeling that we felt walking into this intensive care nursery and to see a team of physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, and observers standing there and all watching history being made. That there were tears of happiness and joy and celebration.
Adriana breathed the liquid for 2 days while her lungs began producing the desperately needed surfactant. Once the ventilator was disconnected, the next step was to empty her lungs of the fluid. How'd they do that? In animal studies, the test subject is turned upside down and drained. With Adriana, doctors did nothing to remove the liquid vent. Because of its quick evaporating characteristics, in less than 2 hours, all traces of the substance were eliminated from her lungs.
There was one doctor that was just an observer, and he said to me later on, he says, we don't know if it was the liquid, if it was all the people in the room that was in there pulling for her, or if it was the power of a higher being. He said, but that little girl had a purpose in life.
On her 1-year birthday, Adriana made a surprise visit to Alliance Pharmaceutical Corporation, a company that manufactures the groundbreaking liquid that helped to save her life. It was a touching moment for scientists who rarely get to see the human results of their hard work in the laboratory.
That was a day that was very emotional for all of us. Adriana was special to us because she was one of the first confirmations that this technology was in fact going to save lives. I think in retrospect I probably held on to her and hogged her way too much because I really was quite touched by just having Adriana there as opposed to the alternative, which was something you didn't want to contemplate at the time.
Has she had any cold, coughs, or any problems breathing?
Nearly 3 years later, Adriana continues to beat the odds.
It's a big choo-choo train making.
This determined little girl is full of life, something Adriana's mother, Tony, attributes to a space-age technology she still finds hard to believe.
I thought, my baby's fighting for her life. What are we doing talking science fiction here? Was that far-fetched? But it saved my daughter's life, and it saved her lungs. It's wonderful.
In addition to saving the lives of premature infants, Liquivent could have a dramatic impact in other areas as well.
Good news. Doctors hope this treatment could help the 700,000 Americans who rely on respirators to keep them alive.
That'd be awesome. 1984.
Yes, you got a spoonful of it. You can breathe underwater.
And so, just close and sorry.
This next bit of the reading talks about how oxygen moves around in the blood. And it has to do with pressures. PCO2 means the pressure of CO2. That's basically the more carbon dioxide you have, the higher the CO2 pressure is. The more oxygen you have, the higher the oxygen pressure. And oxygen always moves from an area of high pressure, or any gas, anything moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So this shows, here's a capillary. And here's inside the alveolus. The pressure of oxygen inside the alveolus is very high, 104 millimeters of mercury. The pressure of oxygen in the bloodstream is only 40 millimeters of mercury. So when the blood comes into the lungs, oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveolus into the capillary. And that's why it shows the capillary getting red here. The blood is getting red because oxygen's going in. And eventually, the pressure of oxygen in the blood reaches 104. Now, CO2 works the opposite way. Carbon dioxide has a pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury in the blood, but only 40 millimeters of mercury in the alveolus. So, carbon dioxide will come out of the blood and go into the alveolus. That's why you're always breathing carbon dioxide out, because it comes out of your blood into your alveolus, and then you breathe it out with your next exhalation. Are y'all with me here? So, the PCO2, the pressure of CO2 as the blood enters the lung is 45, but as it leaves the lung, it's only 40. Some of the CO2 has exited. Now, let's look. What is this showing? Oh, this is showing how the oxygen molecules bond to hemoglobin molecules. And so each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygens. We call it oxyhemoglobin. And you can see when they come in to the lungs, they only have 3 oxygens, but when they come out of the lungs, they each have 4 oxygens, so they're carrying an extra oxygen. And then when they finally get to the tissues, they dump the oxygen off. See, the tissues have a very low pressure of oxygen, only 40 millimeters of mercury. So oxygen is going to fall off the blood that has 95 millimeters of mercury here, and it's going to fall off of it into the tissues. Does this make sense, or am I talking Greek up here? Talking Greek or making sense? Talking Greek? Does that make sense? Questions? Anyone have questions here of this diagram? It's on the test. Something like it is on the test. Questions about it are on the test. Stuff always goes from where there's a lot to where there's less. And that's just exactly what's happening here with the oxygen. So there are 3 ways that carbon dioxide is carried in the blood. Carbon dioxide, it comes from cells as a waste product. It can be dissolved in the plasma. It can combine with hemoglobin to form a new substance called carbaminohemoglobin. That's a big name. Carbaminohemoglobin is hemoglobin and carbon dioxide combined. And that happens in the cells. This is a cell right here, if you're wondering what that big red blob is. And then also, carbon dioxide can react with water to form a new substance called HCO3-. That's known as a bicarbonate ion. Have you ever heard of bicarbonate? It's also called baking soda. You ever heard of that? Baking soda is sodium bicarbonate, but that's close. So there is this molecule floating around your blood called HCO3-, and that's how a lot of the carbon dioxide floats around in your blood. And at the lungs, the CO3 will dissociate from the water and go back to CO2 and come out of the blood into the lungs. So there's 3 different ways carbon dioxide is carried. Just dissolved in the plasma, combined with hemoglobin, or as the HCO3 molecule. This shows how carbon dioxide comes away from all those processes in the lungs. All right, well, I'm tired of talking to y'all. Y'all aren't listening. We still have some IDs to do, and still waiting on my dad to come and talk about whatchamacallit.